Haven't previously heard of the Office of Tax Simplification, you may be having two thoughts just now. The first is, what is the Office of Tax Simplification? And the second could be, well, they haven't done a very good job, have they? So I thought I would begin by explaining what we are and how we work. We were established some 6 years ago, initially as something of an experiment, to offer advice to the Chancellor on ways of simplifying the tax system. And under my predecessor, John Whiting, have covered a huge amount of ground over the last 6 years on the basis of very carefully researched pieces of work, taking evidence from wide numbers of stakeholders, in order to shed light on parts of the tax system which can be simplified, either in quite a detailed way with specific proposals, or in a broader way, just pointing to areas which require some further work. So I hope that sets out my stall and that we actually have done a very good job over the last 6 years. Of course, the way forward was also a gross misrepresentation. What I'd like to do, I think, in just 15 minutes is to ask a number of questions for further discussion and thought. Well, the OTS has been very active in ways of working. This is a list of the various reports, papers that we've issued over the last few years. Employee benefits expenses, employment status, etc., a gig economy, focus paper, a small business taxation, and we're planning some further work in many of these areas. What I'd like to do is to touch a little on our employment status report, which was issued back in 2015. Now, the findings of that exercise were that employment status was a problem because of changing work patterns and that it was getting worse. And broadly, there seemed to be two directions in which we could move to improve matters. The first was to tackle the definitions, employment, self-employment, worker, and the second was to challenge the underlying rules to, so to say, take the heat out of the issue. After all, if people are treated in the same way, irrespective of the way in which they're working, then it doesn't matter what we characterise their way of working. It was recognised, and today is a marvellous reflection of this point, that what was needed here was a coming together of experts in employment law, benefit law and tax law to find common solutions to what are very intricately connected problems. And so within government it seemed necessary for HM Treasury, HM Revenue and Customs, the Department of Work and Pensions, Department of Business, to come together to explore the issues together. Now, as far as the OTS future work is concerned, I'll just mention now one of the areas that we're very interested in thinking about, as well as the legislation, the structure of the tax system, but is the experience people have when they interact with the tax system, the user experience, if you like. So focusing here on the user experience, it's obviously a concern for the person who's about to start working for the first time, not quite sure whether they are employed or self-employed and therefore what their obligations are, or the person who thought they were employed but actually turns out that they're told they're self-employed, or anybody else in a position, perhaps someone wanting to take on someone to help them at home, not being quite sure whether to set up a pay-as-you-earn scheme or whether they can be treated as self-employed. So there are innumerable situations with which we'll all be familiar where what is required by an individual user of the tax system is a degree of certainty. So the findings of the project on employment status were, not surprisingly, there are no easy solutions here. The proportion of self-employed people is increasing. We've seen statistics earlier on today. There are differing working patterns, and something which came through loud and clear was that there are many people who, as we saw earlier, will have an employment and a self-employment and various other engagements and some gig engagements from time to time. And so we need to be able to address the situation of a person having many of these, which will change over time, and we'll want to do so with as little complexity as possible. Now, the drivers to all of this uncertainty and difficulty, from a business's point of view, they want, in fact, to achieve certainty. They want to manage risk, they want to understand where they are in terms of employment rights, and in terms of individuals, people choose, in some cases, where they're able to, the way they wish to work for lifestyle reasons, and of course people will be mindful of their tax position in exercising their choices. The project looked at the global comparisons, and as we saw today, that's extremely instructive. Many countries have the same problem to one degree or another. Nobody can really be said to have solved it. I'm very interested in the Canadian and the Brazilian approach, which is that the differences in treatment of employed or self-employed individuals have been minimised, so there's less importance attaching to determining which is which. We heard today about the Australian and the US statutory rules, and in Germany we found that the status is elective. I think Germany is very interesting. The number of people operating through unincorporated business structures vastly exceeds the proportion, for example, in this country, and it was worth looking at why that is. The project recommended a number of ideas: direct solutions, better guidance, rulings, a specialist helpline, the employment status indicator. I've tried it out myself. It's pretty good in some cases. It's more difficult in other cases. And frankly, the designers, I think, have done a heroic task in designing what they've done. There is just such a multitude of different working practices and arrangements that to design an online tool is quite a challenge. A statutory employment test, there was some debate, I think, today as to whether there should be bright lines, a statutory test. I found that the arguments in favour of having a statutory test are quite convincing. I also found the arguments in favour of not having a statutory test quite convincing as well. So I think that clearly we need to debate this a little bit further. The indirect solutions I do find alluring, and if we can take the heat out of the issue by removing some of the differences, I don't hear in the discussion we've had today any dissenting view that that would be a good idea if we could get there. But we need to harmonise, or at least consider, a whole range of issues, including national minimum wage, employment rights, auto-enrolment, other pension entitlement. There is so much to this that it's very, very complicated when we try and draw it all together. Oops. Now, the OTS has spent a considerable amount of time thinking about national insurance contributions and has done some work on simple and fairer NICs. There's certainly a very strong body of opinion that NI and income tax should be brought closer together. Some people suggest that they should be combined. Some people suggest that NI is somewhat out of date. A simpler and fairer system would treat everyone's earnings in the same way. Having said that, there are many reasons why combining the two, I won't get into now, our report on income tax and national insurance contributions is definitely worth a read. But there are many reasons why combining is awfully difficult and complicated. I won't, we cover this in tens and tens of pages, so I won't try to cover it now. But what we have set out is a step plan for bringing income tax and national insurance contributions into closer alignment. Now, any changes will be very challenging. 40% of the working population would experience a change, particularly part-time workers, women, those under 35, those in lower paid service would gain. Those earning more than £20,000, multi-jobbers, would pay more in national insurance contributions. I should put up a chart in just a moment, just showing that the enormity of the problem with so many people being affected. There was, though, near universal support for a degree of closer alignment. The contributory principle is not particularly well understood. There are some misunderstandings, so perhaps some further enlightenment would be helpful. And some of the differences can create administrative burdens and confusion in people who are trying to operate or understand how it all works. Well, I'll put the chart up. Now, this chart shows the number of people who would gain if national insurance contribution and income tax were brought closer into alignment, so the same threshold, same mechanism, and the number of people who would lose. The total number of gainers and total number of losers, many millions in both camps, and in different parts of the income scale. So clearly not a project to be undertaken lightly by a chancellor. Hugely problematic, and something that requires I think much further thought and consideration. Well, small company taxation. I think we've heard several times today that some people would feel there's an incentive in various ways to form a company in which to carry on their business. And we saw an example this morning of how in certain circumstances that can be advantageous. Well, why do people form companies? There clearly are some who form it for the benefit of limited liability. Some will have the tax position in mind. Some will have name protection in mind or status. We've certainly heard that people who can describe themselves as doing business through a company feel that provides a certain status they wouldn't have if transacting as an individual. Sharing ownership, perhaps of family members or others, to retain funds for investment or for smoothing purposes. So there are many reasons why people might want some kind of incorporated form. And as was mentioned earlier, the OTS came forward with the idea of a SEPA, a sole enterprise with protected asset. Now the idea here is that this would be someone who effectively carries on business as a sole trader, would be treated as a sole trader for most purposes, and certainly for tax purposes, but would register the SEPA in order to get protection in particular for their primary residence. In asking people, well, would this be used? The answer seemed to be yes, it would. Would it be accepted by bankers and others, for example? Well, initial responses suggested that it would be, and that from a practical point of view, it would be much simpler than having to form a company. There are some practicalities around registration, but we know in some countries, if you want to carry on business at all, you have to register the business with an authority of one kind or another. That seems to work pretty well in many countries, so this seems to be quite an attractive option. Now, I'm going to go fairly quickly through these slides, but I did want to spend a couple of minutes talking about look-through taxation. So this is where someone has set themselves up in an incorporated form, but the tax system at least looks through that company and treats them as an individual for tax purposes. Is this a simplification? Well, after a fairly detailed piece of work, the OTS concluded that at present it's not much of a simplification because there's still a requirement to form a company, still a requirement to prepare financial statements, at least at present. There would still be a requirement to carry out all kinds of adjustments to arrive at taxable profit. In fact, it could be that the complication is even greater than if we simply treated the entity as a company. Now, it is interesting, and this is an area which requires further thought and we should continue to look at as the world changes. Perhaps in future there will be easier ways of forming and operating a company. At the moment you have to produce financial statements, albeit limited financial statements for the company. Perhaps in future there'll be an easier regulatory regime for companies and we can look again. As I say, it's interesting that in Germany many businesses of substantial size will operate in unincorporated form. In the US, on the other hand, a very large number of smaller businesses will operate in an incorporated form, but as a look-through for tax purposes, the typical S corporation used in many cases by the so-called mum-and-pop store. And I think that's also worth looking at as well. Not that I've found over the years that the US is an obvious place to look when simplifying the tax system. More recently, the OTS published a focus paper on the gig economy. And I'd just like to point out one or two areas which emerged in that piece of work. I'll start at the bottom corner there with HMRC. The gig economy creates all kinds of problems for a tax administration, which I think are worth reflecting on. So, for example, if a business employs 10,000 employees, HMRC can interact with the employer in a very efficient way. If the business employs 10 employees and a huge number of self-employed individuals, the task of looking after that administrative effort is vastly greater than it was before, not just for all of those individuals who have to learn about things they would never dreamed they would have to master, but also for HMRC. The compliance issues and risks are so much greater than they would have been with the old model. And this, I think, flows through on the left there to issues for the exchequer. it's not just the difference in the NIC treatment of all those self-employed people compared with all of those employees, but it's the compliance risk, and it's building a system that can cope with all of those issues. For platform providers, there are all kinds of questions, really. How much should they support their users in relation to tax? If the users are genuinely self-employed, a platform provider wouldn't necessarily want to be pushed into the business of providing tax advice. Should there be software packages? Should there be publicly provided software or applications available over the internet through which someone who is self-employed with simple affairs can simply handle it all fairly automatically? Well, I'll come back to a few forward-looking thoughts about technology in just a moment, but these are all the sorts of questions that arise for others, including the hirer of the gig economy individual, as well as the individual. So a very wide range of problems that all need to be addressed. Now, my final slide, and this again is a gross misrepresentation. I've called it I Have a Dream. Well, first of all, this is not necessarily my dream. It's definitely not meant to be the OTS's dream, and just for the sake of good order, I'll say it's most definitely not the Treasury's dream or anybody else's dream. But I've just set out here a vision for what the future perhaps could look like, and we can debate whether this is a good dream or a nightmare. But let's suppose for a moment that all ways of working are treated now similarly for tax purposes and for NIC purposes, as well as for benefits, pension contributions, entitlement, legal rights and minimum wage and everything else. So everything is treated exactly the same, irrespective of the basis on which you are working. Now, I'm quite sure that there will be many here, including probably all the employment lawyers, who would immediately want to be thrown out now as being wholly unrealistic, but I'm a tax person trying to simplify. So let's assume that we could achieve such a position. I think it means that perhaps the expenses involved, if not reimbursed to the individual, would probably be treated similarly as well. And if it happened that there were no tax or benefit incentive to choose one or the other, I think what it would mean to me is that an economic choice would then be made for the right reasons, that the person choosing whether, if they had the choice, whether to work as an employee or self-employed, would be doing so according to the nature of the work they were undertaking. Now, maybe we should debate here as to who ought to have the choice, how would the choice be exercised. It's all rather difficult, I think. But one thing that we haven't discussed so much today, but I think is well worth thinking about, is how technology might change the way in which we make some of these choices, and might change the way in which we're able to administer the taxation, whatever it may be, of the employed and the self-employed person. So what if all forms of working could somehow be automatically reported, or information made available to the tax administration? Now, in some countries, there is very, very widespread and thorough use, for example, of fiscal tills, which means that as transactions are recorded in the till, they are automatically uploaded to the tax administration website. And there's a lot of thought being given to this. So you can buy, apparently, according to the OECD report, software as a service which will mask or disguise certain proportion of the sales made through the till. So sophisticated tax administrations therefore insist on the inclusion of a black box in the fiscal till which counteracts the effects of the software as a service. So now that has very little to do with employment or self-employment, but I think it illustrates to me that if we think creatively, are there ways in which engagements of all kinds can be captured through the use of technology? And we can capture all kinds of things through bank accounts, through automatic downloads of data. So there are many, many ways of capturing many of these things. Can we use technology to help people provide the information that needs to be provided on a timely basis, for example? So all income and expenses, if we're automatically reporting these using the technology solutions, we can perhaps get away from an annual calculation. We can do it more often. Now, if we have people in the gig economy with multiple assignments through the course of the year, it's a much more sensible way of trying to deal with that. Tax can be paid on a regular basis to smooth the cash flows. So anyway, this is all here as something of a view of the future where technology may smooth the way. Probably glossed rather quickly over some of the difficulties that, as OTS, we identified in the various reports. But I'll stop there so that we have time to have a discussion.